Hello, and welcome back to Practically Political. I'm Dave Spencer, and it is great to be sitting in the same studio with my two partners in crime, Ashley and Kurt. It's great to be with you. Usually we are a few thousand miles apart, so it's great to be close. It is June 30th, as Kurt's hero Steve Bannon would say, 2025, the year of our Lord. And it's great to be with you. And as always, there are myriad things to talk about. So why don't we start with the retirement of Tom Tillis. He announced he is not running, and the polls were not looking good for his primary. And the Wall Street Journal has an interesting editorial piece this morning saying how Trump has just put the Senate in play in 2026. They also talk about the only Senate candidate who could lose in Texas, which of course is Ken Paxton, who is truly one of the great reprobates in politics, who survived impeachment in the Senate after being impeached by his own party by one vote. He was the Andrew Johnson of state politics. And so also Susan Collins, I don't know if she's announced whether she's going to run. I've heard some people said she is. But the Wall Street Journal said instantly she wasn't. That's always going to be a tough seat. Obviously, they can afford to lose 3 seats. But I just wanted to get your thoughts. And it really comes into a bigger theme of what I was talking about. And that is there a value to a so-called moderate Republican, right? Because look at Susan Collins said and Lisa Murkowski, well, we're not supporting the bill. We're just voting to proceed with it, but we're not going to support it unless there's major changes. Rand Paul's a no. Ron Johnson pulled a Ron Johnson, and after making noise, of course, fell into line. So what do you folks think on that? Why don't I start with you, Kurt?
I think it's really troubling that we've gotten to a point where the only time it seems that senators are willing to vote their conscience is if they know that they're on their way out the door. Time and again, we see people vote for things that they know and would privately concede is not something that they are, ideologically behind, but because they don't want to risk the wrath and ire of, their party leader, in this case, Donald Trump, they hold their nose and vote for it. And in this case, the only time that we've seen senators ever really stand up to Donald Trump is when they're on the retirement circuit. And that's not how it's supposed to work. And it certainly isn't supposed to work that if you don't do X, then we're going to threaten you with Y. You're kind of taking the voice away of the people who actually elected these senators in the first place. You are saying that your agenda takes priority over their state's agenda. I worked for back in the day for Olympia Snow from the great state of Maine. One of the true swing votes at the time. She was always being courted by the White House as well as the party leadership because she routinely would vote her state over any of the DC political machinations. And it's interesting watching. You mentioned Susan Collins earlier. I remember Susan Collins, her staff had such an inferiority complex when it came to Olympia. She felt like the second cousin of Maine because Olympia was so beloved and entrenched there. And now, watching Olympia retire, go off to the sunset because she didn't want to be a part of this version of Washington, which she astutely saw was coming down the pike 10 years ago. Now Susan's senior senator from Maine, important swing vote. And yet, what does she really do with it? Other than hem and haw, sometimes she says, oh, I don't like how this is going. I have concerns. And then ends up just going around and voting for it anyway, which is why even though the chatter is she probably will run again. It wouldn't shock me if she exits stage left too at this point. It seems like anybody in the Republican Party that has half an operational brain and some sort of conscience and moral clarity and compass, they're heading for the exits.
Yeah, and by the way, if you are going to not run, where were you when it came to Pete Hegseth? Where you were the deciding vote to confirm him because you were scared about your family's security or whatever.
Well, Pete Hegseth did pull off a pretty good attack last week, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. But what about who on the Democrat side are considered moderates anymore? Because I would say the same thing, and that's a serious question. I would say the same thing on the Democrat side too. The moderates are just hard to come by these days. But going back to Tillis, he's a very serious member. He's a fantastic guy. It's going to be a loss to North Carolina that he's leaving. I don't know if he would have ever survived a primary no matter what. Mm-hmm. With the state's purple, but the Republican side of the party is pretty conservative. So I think he just saw the writing on the wall. He didn't believe in many aspects of this bill. He wanted a lot of changes, and he decided to pull the plug. But if I were him, I would have done the same, just in regards to being beat up the next year and a half.
Sure.
And also, you then give potentially, from a Republican primary perspective, you maybe get to have someone coalesce behind one candidate. So, I don't remember when the primary is in North Carolina, but you would have gone to him losing the primary most likely, and then that person trying to run against, if it's Governor Cooper or whoever it's going to be.
I do think that Republicans, and I know right now they're riding high. They have all the levers of power. It kind of reminds me of the Republican Party of California in the mid-'90s, who had Governor Pete Wilson, had control of the state assembly and the state senate. They were riding high. And then a decade later, they had gone so far to the right, and their primary process pushed their candidates so far to the right that they ended up out of power completely in every state race, in the entire state senate, and it completely flipped. And people talk about California, it's so blue, it's so left, it's so progressive, so these things. It actually wasn't that long ago that it was controlled primarily by Republicans, but because they ran away from their own values, they embraced the fringe right. The fringe right became the establishment of the Republican Party, and then Republicans became an endangered species in the state of California. When I look at what's going on with Tillis, when I look at even in Texas, where you're potentially nominating perhaps the most flawed candidate to run statewide that you possibly could, in my opinion, where almost anybody, John Cornyn would get elected in a cakewalk. Let's be clear about that. Greg Abbott would get reelected in a cakewalk. The one guy who could actually be potentially, a failure here is the one that's going to win the primary most likely. And I see this trend from Republicans across the board. At least one thing about Democrats I'll say is Maryland had a Republican governor in Larry Hogan and elected a Democrat. Kentucky has elected, a Democrat governor. It's like there are places where being a more middle of the road Democrat is working. And at least at the statewide level with some of these, governorships, that's what we're seeing from Democrats.
Well, being middle of the road, but you can't say that blanket when you have someone like Dave McCormick, who won in Pennsylvania, who is not extreme right at all. I mean, he's very practical. I think he and Senator Fetterman are actually having a really good co-relationship together. I know the Democrats are down on Fetterman right now, but I give him credit because, again, it is the blue. I mean, and if Dave ever needs to vote against Republicans on things, Pennsylvania is another example of a purple state, just like North Carolina. But you're saying this about Republicans, and can we pivot to what just happened in New York? Because that is not moderate Democrats.
I definitely want to talk about it, but let me just make a comment on Dave McCormick. Okay, he's not up for re-election in 6 years, but he didn't stand up to one of the nominees. He just fell in line where he could have sent a message, hey, I'm going to be my own guy. And he didn't do that. If he didn't
agree with some of the nominees, but maybe he did. I don't know.
Well, the same thing, Bill Cassidy in Louisiana, another one. He's going to lose his primary. He voted to convict Trump. And he was the one that could have stood up and blocked RFK. And RFK just absolutely humiliated him by totally disregarding the one pledge that was ironclad. I am not going to disband that vaccine panel. And he does. And so there's no consequences for it. So Cassidy has egg all over his face.
Can I just say one more thing,
Please.
Going back to what you were saying at the beginning of, there is one senator who has gone against Trump on everything, and he survives. Which is Rand Paul. Yeah. He does not vote for anything, and he was with him this weekend, socially. So, I mean, for some reason, maybe because he is so upfront about it, and
that's exactly what it is.
You don't need his vote right now.
He owns it. A lot of these senators, I've never understood this. You are a United States senator, for crying out loud, and yet they tiptoe around and they try to, I'm going to vote against it, but I'm not going to make a big deal. Like Rand Paul, whatever you think of him, he owns who he is, and he's unapologetic about it. And one thing about Trump that I've observed is he respects strength. Even if you disagree with them, even if you're opposite him, if you are strong about it, he'll at least acknowledge, okay, I respect, I disagree with you and I wish you wouldn't be like this and I'm going to talk trash about you, but you can take it. You're strong enough to deal with it. If you're just, I'm against you and I'm going to slink away and walk away and take my ball and go home, that screams weakness to me. And I think that's been the fatal flaw of what we used to know of the Republican Party that I certainly was once a member of, is I've watched so many of these people retreat in silence and slink away, and it's just such weak sauce.
Well, that was my point about Dave McCormick, because senators have 6-year terms for a reason, because they're supposed to be shielded from accountability, right? And so the fact if you're just elected and you can't even take one vote to stand up in principle, I think that's a really bad sign. But we have to move on and talk about the earthquake that happened in my hometown, New York City, where a 33-year-old state legislator, Zoram Mamdani, won a primary over Andrew Cuomo. And I've really been thinking a lot about this, and I blame the Democratic establishment for this, because the Mike Bloombergs, the Bill Ackmans, all these people, they foisted a candidate on the electorate who nobody liked, was out of sync, was a has-been, was deeply corrupt, resigned in disgrace. The list goes on. And then they're shocked when the voters reject this candidate.
Or the establishment in general.
And so I really think it's just like I blame Biden probably more than anyone for Trump being back in power for all the stuff he did. And we've talked about that before, so we don't need to get back into it. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because I don't see a lot of introspection from the Democratic Party. I haven't seen any Bill Clinton. I need to, if you're going to win, you've got to take on and make people in your own team uncomfortable.
Yeah, I've watched my Republican friends make a big deal out of the ideological situation here of obviously a self-proclaimed socialist and all that. I don't think that had anything to do with it. I think that one, we have seen time and again, the quality of candidates actually does matter. Whether it was Herschel Walker in Georgia or or Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania in his failed Senate run, or in this case, someone with so much baggage. Of course he lost. Only a delusional, narcissistic, moron would think he had a real shot at winning this thing on just name ID and entrenched old political alliances. Like, that's old New York. That's not the world that we live in anymore. So I think one, quality candidate matters. Two, I do think that, again, this is someone who was unapologetically themselves. Like, authenticity does count for something. No matter what people think of Donald Trump, they believe that who we see on TV is exactly who he is as he walks around, the White House all day long. Same thing with this guy. Like, he is as advertised. There is something about authenticity. And three, something Democrats have failed to understand, which perplexes me to this day. But ever since 2016, we have been in an anti-establishment, anti-incumbent electorate mindset. So when you run as the pillar of establishment, you are going to lose by and large. That's why Donald Trump has been running as an outsider, despite the fact that he has now been on the scene and controlling the Republican Party for more than a decade. He's actually the ultimate insider at this point in terms of where the reins of power are, but he runs and casts himself as an outsider. There's a reason for that. Democrats need to wake up and understand it's less about labels like progressive or social or liberal or conservative. It's about being an outsider versus an insider.
And Woody Allen always said 90% of life is showing up. And the one little event that just perfectly encapsulated this election was Andrew Cuomo literally took a car for 5 blocks to get from one place to another.
Yeah,
okay?
I think
Mamdani was out there
in New York.
And that's what Donald Trump, by the way, did brilliantly in 2016. He would go on any show. He would show up for anyone.
And this time, too.
And just like Trump, people say, this guy's not a typical politician, right?
Exactly.
That's what you always hear.
So wonder what happens. I said the day after, well, first of all, the power of social media. And they hit, whether he was doing TikTok or any of the social media, the power of that I think the establishment is not using as well. But two, where's Eric Adams now? Obviously he's running as an independent. I saw Cuomo staying on the ballot as an independent as well, or thinking about it.
Yeah, there's a draft Cuomo movement, which is just...
Come on.
But because of some of the policies that are, free everything, do people kind of wake up to the primary, to the general, and vote for Eric again? I mean, is he the luckiest person that came out of this primary?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And it's really TBD, because I don't think that Mamdani's candidacy is going to age well, because people were seduced by what a charming guy he is, how articulate he is.
The rapping is quite good.
But the rapping is great. But when you look into, state-controlled grocery stores and rent freezes and a $30 minimum wage and some of the stuff that he's talking about.
And no billionaires.
And, you know, we don't, I wish there weren't billionaires.
Sounds very popular though.
You know,
these like, I think most people who agree the rent is too damn high. They agree groceries are too expensive. They agree too few have too many. I think that's actually a populist message that could do really well right now, especially in these conditions that we find ourselves in.
I think that's true. But as a native New Yorker, what ails New York now is that so many things are just broken in terms of the way the city operates, in terms of the way the public sector unions, in terms of the contractors. You know, a classic example is that subway system, which was ridiculously more expensive than any other subway system in the world when they built the Second Avenue subway and the Hudson Yards extension. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens, you know, how well his candidacy ages. I think that's going to be one of the
if
great
he runs as the
challenges.
anti-incumbent and Adams is the incumbent, it's like, hey, you broke it. You could have fixed it by now. You didn't. So let's give someone else a try. That's always an easier message for anybody to make.
He doesn't have a record.
Right.
He has comments, but he doesn't have a record.
Right.
So, and I guess we have to talk a little bit about foreign policy, because obviously what's going on with the whole Iran thing, I find very interesting, because it just shows that Trump he can't even be a little bit wrong. You know, the classic example of that was the whole so-called Signal Gate thing.
Mm-hmm.
If they just said, hey, you know, we made some mistakes, we're moving on, it won't happen again, it would have been over. But he can't do that, right? And so they're sticking, and now he has all his cronies echoing it. You know, you have to appease the dear leader or whatever. And Pete Hegseth says, oh, they were totally obliterated. And so my concern is that, yes, they've been severely damaged, but Iran now, you could argue, has more incentive than ever to make a nuclear bomb, because they look at the states that survived, look at the ones that didn't. Most of the ones that survived, i.e. North Korea, nuclear weapons. Ones that didn't survive, i.e. Libya, abandoned their nuclear program. So I guess my question to both of you is, how do you feel about that? And is the administration, my worry is that Trump's attention span is not that long, as we know. So he's going to lose interest, and Iran could then, because I don't think there's going to be some kind of peace deal, Iran could try to accelerate getting back into having a nuclear bomb. What say you, Ashley?
Well, Israel's not going to lose interest. So even if Trump goes on to something else, Israel's not. You saw what happened even this weekend with another Hamas leader being killed. But listen, you know, foreign policy, I'm much more conservative than you two on, but we are better off today than we were a week ago in regards to the nuclear weapon at least being developed. I have no idea, and neither do you two, how far and how long that they're not going to be able to do it. We don't know yet. And something that was driving me crazy last week when the leaked report came out, which from a national security perspective, I hope that person is fired. That's not a political statement. That's just, we can't have that happening.
It was very irresponsible. I agree.
But there are 17 other agencies that will put their, that come into these final reports, and plus all of Israelis' intelligence, and I'm sure we have other intelligence throughout the world that we're doing. I mean, so did we destroy everything? Probably not. However, for the last 30 years, we've been talking about doing something and negotiating and not negotiating with this regime. They're the biggest terrorist sponsors in the world. So whether we destroyed it for 2 months, 6 months, or 6 years, I mean, I don't think they already hate us. It's been death to America for 30 years that I know of, more than that probably. So how much more can they hate us? I don't know if them bombing the 3 sites is going to make them hate us more. That's already there.
Well, and by the way, I think it's so important that we
should thank our military.
Honor the incredible skill of our. There's no other country in the world that could have pulled this.
And
off.
It makes you proud,
and
right?
It makes you proud to be an American.
Yes.
The precision, 37 hours refueling in the air. It was just a huge achievement. And so I have no problem with the action. My issue was the way it was handled. But what do you feel, Kurt?
I think that time will tell. This is one of those things where we don't know what we don't know, which I agree with Ashley. No one knows really. What I do know is I just assume whatever the administration says about it, they're lying. This is an administration that's lied about trivial things like crowd sizes at events, to far more important things like they lie as easily as they breathe. They try to tell us what we see as reality isn't reality. They lie about the fairness of a free and fair election in America. They lie about what happened on January 6th. If you are willing to lie about a domestic terrorist attack on the United States Capitol, you are willing to lie about anything, especially about something that happened thousands of miles away. So I assume that whatever they say is a lie. So when they say we obliterated, I'm just going to assume the exact opposite. You didn't obliterate. We'll find out in the future. If it turns out in 6 months or 12 months, we go, turns out they're a lot closer than we thought. I'm going to go, well, didn't you obliterate them? You can't use this as an excuse anytime soon. So you better hope to God that between now and the next year or two, they don't make an aggressive action, that we don't have some sort of attack on American soil because of this. Because if that happens, that will be Trump's defining legacy moment, and it will age poorly and horribly. Also, I never want to hear again from any Republican in Congress if a Democrat president launches a military action that they need to get congressional authorization. That died with this operation.
Yeah, and I actually think that died under Bush. I actually think that we've been doing it back and forth for a long time, and that's not a political statement, just as. Right. But here's the other thing. Again, from a national security background, is I think that anything that we're being told, we should not believe. Because I know, in general, because the American people should not know every single move that our defense national security teams are doing. It's just like that's not how we ever managed. I remember after 9/11, knowing certain things, certain terrorist cells and all of that, and then the public was thinking something else. Well, that was good. The public didn't need to know that there were 6 terrorist cells, on the East Coast trying to kill us every day. So I think ignorance is bliss.
It is. I mean, there is you don't want to incite panic. You don't want incite, again, people trying to take matters in their own hands, disrupting, actual operations like that. That can happen very quickly. Panic can spread. Hysteria can spread. So it is the responsibility of the government to try to keep everyone at bay as much as is realistic. But also, again, I just think that this administration has absolutely no credibility when it comes to just telling the truth.
Right.
The sleeper cells are nerve-wracking.
Yes.
Yeah.
But they would have been nerve-wracking.
Right, but
this may have.
But we just gave them a reason to
correct. I understand that point.
That's my concern.
But they're already here.
No, we know that they're here.
I agree, because I don't think they're going to do something overt, like try to block the Strait of Hormuz or something like that, because that would be very blatant and they would get it. But I do think, as you say, that unleashing the terror cells, they claimed they had people over here when they ordered those assassinations. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, again, they could have been lying, but look, one of the things about a free society, even look at the Saudi hijackers, right? It's not hard to get in. It's not hard to.
And they're not going to do something like hijack a plane anymore. Like that was so 2000, right? I mean, like if I were them watching what happened during COVID.
Yes,
the biological warfare is the scariest
scenario.
Yes.
You want to biological warfare and cyber warfare, like that is the way of the 21st century. Mm-hmm. You want to grind everything to a halt, mess with a power grid, mess with a banking system. Like, there are sophisticated tools that can, ask any parent what happens when the power goes out and the iPad stops working.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Well, on that cheerful note, I think we'll have to leave it. But thanks again to all of you for joining us on Practically Political. We will have to do a show in California. Now that we've done an East Coast show,
West
we'll have
Coast,
to do
Best
a
Coast.
West Coast show. I look forward to having my comrades out there.
We can do one on the boat.
Yes,
there we go.
Perfect.
We can do a cruise
New
around the
York.
Nautical Dave.
We're doing it. Yes. So thanks to all of you for joining us on Practically Political. For my 2 partners in crime here, I say thanks again, and we will see you next time.